So now that I have figured out how much resin I'm needing, I'm using moss epoxies, and I have a part B and a part A. So you need, for this particular brand, you need equal parts of each one. So I am going to pour. So if I need 200 milliliters, I'm going to do 100 milliliters of part A and then 100 milliliters of part B. And it's much easier if you have containers with measurements on the side. If you do not, you can use a scale, but it's not equal parts by weight when it comes to a scale, so you'll want to make sure to follow the directions for that so that you're weighing each amount correctly, because each part doesn't weigh the same amount per volume or whatever. I don't know what the actual term right this second is. All right. So now I've got equal amounts there. If at any point you actually touch the resin, don't do that with hands without gloves on. So I'm going to put some gloves on so that I am not touching. All right, so according to the resin directions, this has to be mixed for 3 minutes. And while I'm mixing it, I make a point to scrape off the sides and scrape off the bottom. And then I also scrape off the side of my mixing stick. It is silicone covered, so once I'm done using this and I put it aside and it cures on here, I can just pick off the resin, so I can keep using this every single time I make resin. I don't need to get new sticks each time. So speaking about the gloves, make sure that you follow all of the safety precautions for the resin that you are using. A respirator, gloves, make sure that you're protected, protect your surface. I also tend to work right beside my sliding door, and anytime I'm working with resin, I have it open so that there's a fresh source of air. I like this resin because it has low VOCs and I don't smell it at all. So if it's colder outside or in your house, your resin will be a little bit thicker. You may want to put it in a sink of water, the whole jug in a sink of water, warm water, hot water, in order to thin it out. And you'll notice that while I'm mixing, I'm getting some bubbles. In order to not have those bubbles in your project, you can take your container and put it in some hot water before you pour it so that they rise to the top. And then I also use a heat gun in order to remove the bubbles that have risen to the surface. I tend to not put my cup into some hot water because I just remove the bubbles once they're in my mold. But if you're wanting to remove as many as possible ahead of time, you can do that. The other thing I tend to do is before I pour my resin into my mold, I'll let it sit for a little while. And by a little while, I mean a couple minutes, so that a lot of the bubbles will rise to the surface. And I'll use my heat gun to remove them, just to reduce the amount that are going right into my project. So you'll notice as I'm doing it, I'm constantly scraping down the sides of my container as well as the bottom, and scraping my mixing spatula. I always put the timer on my stove on so I know exactly how long. That way I don't get distracted. And sometimes you can actually see, like when you first start, you'll see some striations in there. And it gets to the point where you can actually see that they're not there anymore, so you know it's mixed up enough. But sometimes, like I've got a lot of bubbles in mine right now. So sometimes having a clock to know that you've mixed it the correct amount of time and not undermixed it for sure is helpful. All right, so I'm gonna let that sit for a couple minutes to let some of those bubbles rise to the surface, and I'll see you again and we'll start pouring into our mold.